This is lecture 5 in the Western Peace tradition. I'll be looking today at liberty and order, particularly what has occurred to the south of us January 6, 2021, and the storming of Capitol Hill. There is a history in the West and in all civilizations in terms of how do we hold together liberty and order, or structure in that sense. Where people live in a context in which order or structure is oppressive, the natural tendency then is to hold high the flag of liberty. It's just over 500 years this year, 1520, that Martin Luther wrote 3 significant pamphlets. One is The Babylonian Captivity, Letters to a German Nobility, and The Liberty of the Christian Man. These 3 booklets, or the liberty of the Christian, it could be interpreted that word. For Luther, liberty was a key element because the order or the structure of what he saw, the Catholic Church, repressed the freedom of Christians, and the Holy Roman Empire politically limited the liberty. Now, what Luther did in his 3 pamphlets is very instructive in terms of liberty and order. 1, liberty was held high and order was the problem. Those who differed with Luther's notion of liberty, i.e. the Catholic Church, his pamphlet, The Babylonian Captivity, to understand the Babylonian captivity and what he's doing there, he draws from the biblical story of the Jews being sent to Babylon and hence being far from their homeland, their people. And so Luther, again, you've got liberty is good, order is the problem. Babylonian captivity, those who disagreed with Luther, they are uncritically immersed in Babylon, and then he appeals to the German nobility to free him from and those who are with him, the Babylonian captivity. And so what you have from the 16th century moving forward, this language of liberty is held high. Order is often seen as the problem. And then those who hold high liberty, the other, if I can use the metaphor, Babylon again, imprisons them, cages them, cabin, cribs, and confines them. Rousseau will use the language of chains versus liberty. Marx will use the language of economic chains versus liberty. The French Revolution will use the language of chains versus the aristocracy that prevented the middle, lower classes, the people, from finding their way. And so liberty and order often live in this difficult tension. When, as I mentioned, order or structure becomes oppressive, the language of liberty is necessary, though not sufficient, to overcome those oppressive structures. But there is this tendency then from Luther going up to the English Civil War that Locke will argue liberty is very important. The French Revolution, 1789, obviously the American Revolution of 1776, Marx's thinking on liberty. So there is this tendency again and again to deconstruct order, to deconstruct structure in the name of liberty. Inevitably what happens though is that new order has to be created, new structure has to be created, and often these new orders can become as oppressive as the liberty-loving people who overcame them. And so in the French Revolution, for example, in the name of liberty, those who were seen as the enemies or part of the Babylonian captivity, they were guillotined. In the Russian Revolution, in the name of the liberty of the proletariat, the bourgeois, and those of the aristocracy, felt the wrath of those who embodied the liberty-loving, the freeing people from the economic chains themselves. Now, the underlying principles of liberty and order are essential to understand in political philosophy as it works itself out in politics itself. I mentioned January 6th, and those, of course, who stormed the Capitol Hill and terrified those within the House and the chambers. Again, what are they drawing from? They're drawing from the language of liberty and order, going back to Trump, where he talks, we have to clean the swamp. This is the cleaning the swamp as he came to power. It was no different than Luther having to deal with Babylonian captivity, with the French Revolution. This dualism, this way of thinking, inevitably not only does it undermine order, but it leads then to the oppression of those who are trying to embody a minimal sense of order by which meaningful liberty can emerge. Because within Western political thought, as within human identity, as in communities, liberty is never a means and ends in itself. The questions that always have to be asked are, what are the conditions that create meaningful liberty? And those conditions, of course, if they are oppressive conditions, then lead to the idealizing or romanticizing of liberty itself as an unquestioned good. And then order or structure is the problem. And of course, the nature of deconstructionism is a political philosophy, and significant elements of postmodern thought with its deconstructionist tendencies just carry on that liberty versus order, liberty versus structural tendencies. We have seen that played out in a graphic and raw way with Capitol Hill on January 6th, and where that leads to. Now let's briefly reflect a little bit on the liberty-order tensions. As I mentioned earlier, order pushed too far that undermines liberty leads to totalitarianism and authoritarianism. Liberty without order leads to fragmentation. It can lead to violence. It can lead to polarization. It can lead to all sorts of activities by which violence occurs, and the whole notion of any sort of minimal order or security or predictability is undermined. But let me return just to the notions of order and liberty, using a variety of analogies in doing so. In a course, we come university, one takes courses to get a degree. The hope is that, of course, you're going to be free to have a degree, free to have a BA. And so within classes themselves, there is an order in this class in poli-sci. We have to go through various thinkers, various readings, midterm tests, final tests, class essays. And so that's the order that is put in place by which then, when a course is finished, you have the freedom to say course completed, moving along in the degree. So liberty itself is a child of the order itself. Now, of course, someone can say, I'm going to use my freedom not to come to class, not to do the reading, not to submit essays. And of course, a person is free to do that, but then they're not free to pass the course. They can sign up for all sorts of courses, but if they never attend, they're not free. And they have the freedom, of course, not to come to classes, not to produce papers, but then they're not free to get their degree. Freedom itself, a byproduct of order. A person could say, I'm going to use my freedom to drive on the opposite side of the road. And of course, if a person thought that, much less did it, there would be chaos in the highway. freedom to feel safe on the highway presupposes an order that one and all must accept in terms of how driving and people will be safe on the road. Freedom, again, is the byproduct. A person could say, I want to use my freedom to put my hand on a hot burner. Now, a person could do that, but they would not be free to have a healthy hand. We respect the order of things, a natural order, a social order we create in driving a car, an order we accept in a university curriculum. And so the whole notion of, in this case, what Trump has done to the south of us in terms of certainly his constant deconstructing any sense of facts, of information, of science. Irony is with the COVID crisis, for example, the United States has some of the finest doctors in the world, some of the best healthcare system. Obviously, many people don't have access to it, given a certain way of understanding how one gets access to that through personal insurance companies. But when you look at the lack of order in organizing how to deal with the COVID crisis across the border, the United States is the worst country in the world in terms of dealing with it and the number of deaths. Last week alone, 22,000 deaths in 1 week. 1 week alone, greater than all of Canada itself in terms of COVID crisis. And what you have is that people arguing, what role has the state to tell me what to do and to tell me to wear masks on my face or not to gather in large groups. So freedom is pitted against order once again, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, it is that way of liberty loving that sees order as the problem, which in one sense has accelerated the COVID crisis and Trump's role constantly in demeaning the role of medical doctors and organizing between states to have a national policy by which a structure could be put in place so that people would be free not to be infected from COVID. So once again, we can see how this liberty-order tension has serious practical implications in terms of basic things in the COVID crisis for people's health. And people who think that just because a government suggests that people stay within a small bubble, that they wear masks, that interferes with their liberty, as if order is the problem and liberty is the divine Sinai principle by which personal, familial, community ways of thinking are best embodied. So the liberty order issue, when played out in the COVID crisis, we can see at the very rawest level where this goes when order or structure and working together interferes with liberty, and people insinuating and insisting either at extreme level it's a conspiracy. One only has to go into a hospital to see it's no conspiracy, or to just chart the number of deaths which are accelerating. Liberty and order. President Trump, in constantly his deconstructionist way of not trusting, not believing, cynicism dominates. And he tends to draw to his fold people who are cynical and skeptical about many things, but person can only maintain a position of skepticism and cynicism for so long. The longing of humans for meaning or to do something significant inevitably turns the cynic and skeptic into a believer of the tyrant, which is very, very dangerous. I'll conclude with a story, one of the stories from Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Arthur and his knights were out hunting the white stag. The stag is always the symbol, as is the unicorn, the symbol in myths of meaning and purpose. And they continued their hunt, and the stag of meaning was elusive, hard to track down, hard to get. But finally, they tracked it down to a river, and the stag disappeared, seemed to drown in the water. Arthur and his knights, inevitably, when meaning seems to disappear, when purpose seems to dissolve, when the stag, as it were, seems to disappear, what the knights did, they lay by a tree in despair, feeling they had failed in their quest for meaning. They wake up, and a ship comes to the shoreline. The ship had glowing lights. There was a banquet prepared on the ship. There were people there to entertain the knights, to give them a place of rest. And so, in their despair, again, it seemed the stag of meaning had disappeared, but here was an attempt to rest from cynicism, to rest from skepticism, and get on the ship by which they would find meaning and purpose. Little did they know that the ship was an enchanted ship by Morgana Le Fay, Arthur's evil half-sister. And when they got on the ship, they were slowly lulled to sleep. The food and the drugs itself, the ship enchanted. Arthur wakes up the next morning only to discover he's in a prison cell. His sword Excalibur gone, his scabbard, i.e. his gifts, his abilities taken from him, and he's in a dark, dank cell. How he was to get out of that cell becomes part of the ongoing story in this particular chapter of the Knights of the Round Table. The point to note here, though, is that women and men in their quest for meaning, and particularly in our time and era, cynicism and skepticism dominates. A form of deconstruction wins the day. But the dilemma is that people still long for meaning. The danger is they become mesmerized by the newest ship that comes by that promises them meaning, not realizing it's an enchanted ship, that it's going to, at the end of the day, leave them even more destitute and derelict in a cell that will be far more difficult to get out of than their initial cynicism, and they become imprisoned. And so one has to be very careful about the ship one gets on, particularly if it's an enchanted ship, and particularly the enchanted ship of liberty or freedom versus order. Now, someone like Trump, in that sense, has appealed to people who are often cynics and skeptics of order, of authority, of formal political process, questioning a whole election process in the name of liberty versus those who run the elections. They're dishonest. They can't be counted on. We want new recounts, insisting that various states do recounts. Well, this is liberty. Liberty, you can't trust the order, the structure of the electoral process. And then all of his disciples and acolytes following this liberty-loving perspective, and they end up getting on the enchanted ship of a certain type of republicanism that, at the end of the day, if they're not careful, they'll lose not only the sword they have been given, but the scabbard, but end up in a cell which is even darker and lead to deeper cynicism. And so in the liberty-order tension in politics, it's very important to understand what are legitimate means of order and structure that are not authoritarian or totalitarian, that lead to meaningful liberty, rather than being put in a place where a person is constantly and psychologically living in a tension between the romanticizing of liberty and freedom and the demonizing of order and structure, as if one is the demon and the enemy and the other is the angel in that sense. Thoughtful people in political philosophy, and as this course is really the ongoing story of Western intellectual thought from the 16th century Reformation up to the 21st century. Important to note then, with Luther and with Trump, and with the period of time between Luther and Trump, we see this issue of liberty and order constantly at odds, and particularly those who freedom and liberty dominates, structure and order is the problem, rather than more thoughtful people thinking through what are the legitimate conditions of order and structure that bring about long-term and meaningful liberty, rather than people living in an either-or, but rather a both-and way of understanding the symbiotic relationship or the tightrope walk between liberty and order. And when that is not done, then people forever live in a reactionary phase, either people on the right driven by order, or people on the left or far right driven by liberty. Now, order can be right or left, just as liberty can be right or left politically. But when people only play up order contra liberty, that's when you get in tragic notions of totalitarian and authoritarianism. But when people play up liberty contra order, that's when also its own form of tragedies can occur. And once victim in power, then often create new victims in the name of order and liberty. So to be thinking through the liberty order as we're going through this, and how this drama plays itself out in every generation in the history not only of Western political thought, but also global politics itself.